Hello and welcome back to Sci-Fi Stories. I want to be honest with you all today. Recently, YouTube completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep operations running. If you enjoy our story today, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to cover their living expenses and continue creating these adventures for you. You can support us by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donate link down in the description and the comments below. The void of space is silent and cold, but nothing among the stars could have prepared the mighty Xylaxian Empire for the raw, mechanical brutality of a Rocky Mountain blizzard. They came to conquer a defenseless world with invisible armor and supreme arrogance. Instead, they landed directly in the path of humanity's most unapologetic force of nature, a 20-ton rotary snowplow with a fully open throttle and a disgruntled operator who just wanted to finish his shift. High above the atmosphere of the primitive blue planet, the dreadnought cruiser of Supreme Commander Vax hovered in geostationary orbit. Vax stood on the elevated command bridge, his secondary eyelids blinking in smug satisfaction as he stared at the glowing holographic tactical display. The Earth was a world ripe for the taking, entirely unaware of the absolute destruction hovering just beyond its gravitational pull. Vax pointed a long, multi-jointed claw at a specific coordinate on the northern hemisphere. He had identified the perfect staging ground for their initial invasion force. According to his orbital scans, it was a vast, completely flat expanse of reinforced terrain. It was an ideal strategic plain, seemingly devoid of any significant military installations or energy shields. Vax possessed a galaxy-conquering intellect. Yet he had absolutely no way of knowing this immaculate landing zone was actually runway number 4 of a highly isolated international airport, nestled deep within the treacherous, towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains. Down on the surface of this strategic plain, a brutal winter storm was raging with apocalyptic intensity. However, the highly advanced biological sensors of the Xylaxian scouting vessels completely misinterpreted the atmospheric data. The alien scanners, designed primarily for atmospheric combat on temperate and tropical worlds, registered the dense, swirling blizzard as nothing more than a heavy atmospheric concentration of harmless plant spores. The ship's artificial intelligence saw the violent, freezing whiteout not as a lethal weather event, but merely as a mild ecological anomaly characteristic of this planet's flora. Vax straightened his posture, his ceremonial armor gleaming under the bridge lights. "Deploy the Vanguard," he commanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. From the belly of the warship, drop pods plummeted through the atmosphere in silent descent. 60 of the Empire's most lethal, highly trained shock troopers dropped from the sky. They touched down upon the frozen asphalt with practiced, deadly precision, their impact completely muffled by the howling wind. Immediately upon landing, the 60 soldiers activated their optical stealth armor. The advanced technology seamlessly bent light around their bodies, rendering them completely invisible to the naked eye. Simultaneously, they switched on their ultrasonic acoustic communication networks, speaking to one another in frequencies far beyond the hearing range of any terrestrial predator. They stood in the freezing, howling dark in perfect formation, fully convinced they were untouchable phantoms, the invisible harbingers of Earth's impending doom. But the vast Xylaxian Empire had never fought in a sub-zero, extremely low humidity environment. The air howling across runway number 4 was brutally dry and bone-chillingly cold. Worse still, the storm was whipping those supposed harmless plant spores across the open asphalt at velocities exceeding 100 miles per hour. As the frozen ice crystals violently scoured against the hyper-advanced synthetic polymers of the Xylaxian stealth suits, an immense, unseen physical reaction began to occur. A massive buildup of static electricity began to pool across the surface of their armor. It started as a subtle, localized crackle of energy. Then, it quickly cascaded into uncontrolled, high-voltage discharges. The stealth cloaks simply could not ground the immense triboelectric charge. Across the dark, windswept runway, the squad of 60 invisible assassins suddenly began to violently strobe. They flickered rapidly in and out of the visible spectrum, flashing erratic bursts of neon blue and harsh white, like a massive field of shattered, dying light bulbs. The elite soldiers panicked. They tapped frantically at their wrist consoles, their ultrasonic chatter filling with sudden, uncharacteristic confusion as their perfect camouflage failed them in the most spectacular and chaotic way imaginable. Before the squad leader could issue an emergency order to recalibrate the stealth matrices, the solid ground beneath their armored boots began to violently tremble. It was not a natural seismic event. It was a rhythmic, heavy, mechanical pounding that vibrated through the thick layers of ice and shot straight up into their skeletal structures. The trembling intensified with every passing second, shaking the loose snow from their armor. Suddenly, the suffocating white darkness of the blizzard was violently pierced by a massive, twin beam of blinding yellow light. The towering halogen high beams cut through the swirling snow like a pair of angry, glowing eyes. The light was utterly enormous, casting long, terrifying shadows of the flickering, glitching alien invaders across the ice. It was moving straight toward their defensive formation. It was not moving with the swift agility of a combat hovercraft or the smooth grace of an anti-gravity sled. Instead, it was approaching with a slow, lumbering, and utterly unstoppable momentum. The Xylaxian troopers scrambled across the slippery surface, desperately trying to align their plasma rifles and form a defensive perimeter against the unknown threat. They were far too slow. Before a single energy weapon could be fully charged, a sound, unlike anything recorded in the vast alien archives, ripped through the freezing air. It was the deafening, mechanical roar of a massive twin turbo diesel engine being pushed to its absolute limit. The sheer acoustic violence of the combustion cycle shattered their delicate ultrasonic communication network instantly, replacing their silent tactical chatter with a solid wall of pure, brutal noise. The ground shook even harder as the monolithic shadow behind the blinding yellow lights surged forward, tearing relentlessly through the storm, opening the curtain on a grinding mechanical nightmare that no amount of alien technology could have ever predicted. Inside the violently vibrating, diesel-stinking, steel-confined cabin of the airport's heaviest piece of machinery, Enoch Bunn was absolutely furious. He was not furious about the impending extraterrestrial subjugation of the human race, primarily because he had no idea it was happening, but mostly because his cab heater had just cut out for the third time this hour. Enoch was 60 years old, a man whose lower back possessed a more accurate meteorological forecasting ability than the entire multi-million-dollar radar array housed in the control tower. He sat hunched over the heavy steering column of a 20-ton, industrial-grade rotary snowplow, a monolithic piece of engineering designed for one singular, violent purpose. It existed to consume solid walls of ice and relocate them elsewhere. The cabin smelled heavily of stale, burnt black coffee, wet wool, and the unmistakable, metallic tang of hydraulic fluid. A worn-out radio, bolted to the dashboard, struggled valiantly to pull a classic country station through the intense, atmospheric interference of the blizzard. The heavy bass of an old steel guitar twang was repeatedly swallowed by bursts of loud, crackling static, mirroring Enoch's rapidly deteriorating patience. He had been behind the wheel for 10 straight hours, chewing his way through the worst winter storm the Rocky Mountains had seen in a decade. He did not care about the geopolitical state of the world. He did not care about the terrifying isolation of the mountain pass. And he certainly did not care about the unearthly phenomena occurring directly in his path. He only cared about clearing runway number 4 before the morning shift supervisor could find a reason to dock his overtime pay. Through the thick, reinforced glass of the windshield, the heavy wiper blades fought a losing battle against the driving snow as the plow lumbered forward, shaking the asphalt beneath its massive, chained tires. Enoch squinted through the frost creeping around the edges of the glass. Ahead of him, partially obscured by the raging whiteout, a cluster of bizarre, flashing lights strobed violently against the darkness. They flickered in chaotic bursts of neon blue and harsh white, illuminating the swirling snow like a malfunctioning discotheque stranded in the middle of a frozen wasteland. Enoch did not see an elite vanguard of hyper-advanced extraterrestrial shock troopers suffering a catastrophic stealth armor malfunction. Enoch saw a massive, bureaucratic headache. He leaned forward, wiping a circle of condensation from the glass with a calloused, grease-stained thumb. "I swear to the good Lord above, if those useless morons in maintenance left another string of temporary LED marker lights out on the tarmac, I am going to feed their clipboards into the auger." Enoch muttered out loud to the empty cabin. His voice was a raspy, nicotine-stained gravel pit that barely rose above the deafening roar of the twin-turbo diesel engines, sitting directly behind his seat. He glared at the flickering, glowing obstacles in his path. According to standard airport safety protocol, any unidentified debris on the active runway required the operator to immediately halt the vehicle, radio the tower, and wait for a designated ground crew to manually inspect and clear the hazard. Enoch thought about the tower. He thought about the tedious paperwork. He thought about standing in the freezing wind, waiting for a supervisor who was currently asleep in a warm office. Then, he looked at the massive, steel-toothed rotary blades sitting at the front of his machine. The machine was quite literally built to chew through solid boulders, frozen tree trunks, and sheer ice walls. A few flimsy strands of cheap plastic lighting were not going to stop his momentum. "Not tonight. I am not filling out an incident report for a pile of blinking trash," Enoch growled, his jaw setting into a stubborn, uncompromising line. Instead of reaching for the air brakes, Enoch's heavy, steel-toed work boot pressed down firmly on the accelerator pedal. He reached out with his right hand and grabbed the heavy hydraulic control lever that governed the front assembly. With a fluid, practiced motion, he shoved the lever all the way forward to maximum capacity. Outside the cab, the front of the 20-ton Leviathan transformed from a mere vehicle into a terrifying, mechanized apex predator. The massive, twin augers, essentially a pair of horizontally mounted steel corkscrews, each the size of a small car, spun up to a blinding rotational velocity. The heavy steel blades whined with a high-pitched, murderous intensity, churning the air and creating a localized vacuum that sucked the surrounding blizzard directly into its metal maw. Behind the augers, the impeller fan, a solid steel wheel meant to launch compacted snow, engaged with a heavy, shuddering thunk. The Xylaxian troopers, still frantically trying to reboot their failing stealth suits and comprehend the massive, roaring beast bearing down upon them, never even had the chance to raise their weapons. The mechanical suction generated by the sheer rotational force of the augers was absolute. Half of the elite alien squad was immediately swept off their feet, caught in an inescapable vortex of crushed ice, freezing wind, and pulverized asphalt. They were violently yanked forward, tumbling head over heels into the gaping, steel-toothed mouth of the rotary plow. Had they been wearing standard infantry gear, the heavy blades would have instantly reduced them to a fine, organic mist. However, the Xylaxian shock troopers were clad in hyper-dense, kinetically absorbent combat armor, forged in the heart of a dying star. The armor was completely impervious to physical crushing. This incredible durability resulted in a highly unintended, physics-defying consequence. Instead of being shredded by the heavy steel teeth, the heavily armored aliens were treated exactly like very large, very stubborn rocks. The spinning augers violently scooped them up, battered them against the frozen inner casing of the plow, and aggressively funneled them backward, directly into the high-speed impeller wheel. With a series of rapid, heavy metallic clangs that Enoch barely registered over the sound of the radio, the invincible alien warriors were violently slammed into the rotating impeller. The sheer centrifugal force was unimaginable. The heavy steel fan blades caught the armored troopers, spun them around the housing with bone-rattling velocity, and forcefully crammed them up the narrow, heavily reinforced vertical discharge chute. Like heavily armored, highly confused cannonballs, exactly 30 Xylaxian elite soldiers were violently expelled from the top of the snowplow. Accompanied by a massive, high-pressure geyser of pulverized snow, they were launched into the freezing night sky. They traveled in a beautifully synchronized, perfect parabolic arc, sailing majestically through the blizzard. They flew 50 meters through the air, completely clearing the edge of the runway, before plunging deep into a towering, heavily compacted snowbank with a series of muffled, defeated thuds. Inside the cab, the heavy mechanical vibration smoothed out as the massive obstruction cleared the chute. Enoch let out a long, satisfied exhale. The blinking, irritating lights were completely gone, replaced once again by the smooth, black, beautifully cleared surface of runway number 4. He reached over to the dashboard and picked up his battered, stainless steel thermos. He unscrewed the lid with one hand and took a long, slow sip of the thick, bitter, completely lukewarm black coffee. It tasted like absolute misery, but to Enoch, it tasted like an uninterrupted workflow. "Good riddance. Glowing garbage," Enoch stated plainly, setting the thermos back into its holder. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, turned up the scratchy country music just a fraction, and kept the heavy accelerator pinned firmly to the floor, rolling the massive mechanical beast steadily forward into the endless white darkness. The remaining 30 shock troopers of the vanguard stood entirely paralyzed in the freezing, violently swirling dark. The towering mechanical beast had just consumed half of their elite unit in a matter of seconds, totally indifferent to their supreme training and advanced biological enhancements. Panic, an emotion that had been genetically purged from their imperial lineage thousands of generations ago, violently clawed its way back into their neural pathways. They scrambled backward in sheer terror, their heavy boots struggling to find purchase on the slick asphalt as the roaring monster continued its relentless, rumbling patrol down the runway, slowly fading back into the blinding white curtain of the storm. The squad leader issued a frantic, high-pitched clicking command through their localized biological communication link. Pure survival dictated an immediate and overwhelming counteroffensive. The 30 highly trained soldiers raised their heavy plasma rifles, aiming directly into the freezing blizzard where the yellow eyes of the beast had disappeared. These plasma rifles were the absolute pinnacle of Xylaxian destructive engineering. They were designed to channel superheated ionized gas through a precisely calibrated magnetic containment field, fully capable of turning heavy planetary armor plating into glowing pools of liquid slag. The troopers synchronized their targeting telemetry, their long digits pressing firmly against the thermal ignition triggers. Nothing happened. There was no blinding flash of destructive cosmic energy, no threatening hum of charging magnetic coils. Instead, a hollow, pathetic click echoed simultaneously from the chambers of their weapons. The ambient temperature of this harsh, earthly plane had plummeted to -35 degrees Celsius. In this brutally extreme, hyper-dry cold, the highly volatile thermal capacitors located inside the plasma rifles experienced an immediate and catastrophic thermal shock. The aggressively supercooled environment bypassed the external weapon insulation entirely. The internal conductive energy gels condensed violently, freezing into solid blocks of useless matter in a fraction of a second. The delicate internal magnetic coils shattered under the rapid molecular contraction. The absolute pride of the Xylaxian military arsenal was instantly reduced to utterly useless. Frozen chunks of dead weight, before the bewildered troopers could even begin to comprehend the complete failure of their primary weapons. A series of dull, rhythmic thumping sounds echoed loudly from beneath the frozen asphalt, right beneath their feet. It sounded exactly like the beating heart of the planet itself, awakening to finish the slaughter that the mechanical beast had started. Hidden entirely, flush within the concrete of runway number 4, a vast network of automated subterranean nozzles suddenly engaged, governed purely by the airport's automated winter hazard protocol. The system was programmed to activate at specific atmospheric moisture and temperature thresholds. With a sharp, synchronized pneumatic hiss that pierced the howling wind, hundreds of high-pressure sprinkler heads violently breached the surface of the tarmac. The freezing air was instantly filled with a thick, pulsating mist. A heavy torrent of viscous, neon-green fluid erupted from the hidden nozzles, raining down upon the devastated alien formation in a sweeping, inescapable arc. To the indigenous human population, this substance was merely a standard industrial de-icing fluid, a heavily concentrated mixture of propylene glycol specifically designed to break down stubborn ice, bonding on aircraft wings and vital runway surfaces. However, the Xylaxian biological armor was a marvel of organic engineering, grown in sterile vats from a highly reactive, symbiotic mucous membrane designed to naturally absorb heavy kinetic impacts and adapt dynamically to atmospheric pressure changes. Against solid kinetic strikes or intense thermal blasters, the armor was functionally impenetrable. Against a heavy synthetic alcohol solvent like propylene glycol, it was incredibly, fatally vulnerable. The thick, neon green rain aggressively coated the 30 survivors. The chemical reaction was instantaneous, violent, and utterly horrifying. A loud, aggressive fizzing sound erupted across the entire landing zone. The concentrated antifreeze immediately began breaking down the complex, carefully woven cellular structure of the alien bioarmor. The once impenetrable, hardened organic shells began to boil uncontrollably. Thick, foul-smelling foam erupted from the joints and plating of the Xylaxian suits. The troopers shrieked in absolute agony as their invincible armor literally dissolved around them. The organic material rapidly lost all structural cohesion, melting instantly into deep, sticky pools of emerald sludge. The heavy chest plates sagged heavily and tore away like soaked, fragile paper. The thick, reinforced biohelmets liquefied completely, dripping down over their facial sensors in blinding, viscous sheets. Within seconds, the supreme armor of the Vanguard was entirely gone, leaving only a chaotic, bubbling mess of green mud pooling thickly around their boots. Stripped entirely of their protective layers, the delicate, pale blue flesh of the Xylaxian soldiers was brutally exposed to the howling elements of the Rocky Mountains. The negative 35-degree wind tore across their unprotected bodies like thousands of microscopic, freezing daggers. Their incredibly thin skin, evolutionary adapted exclusively for the highly controlled, temperate, and humid environments of their homeworld, immediately began to crack and blister open under the sudden, agonizing exposure to the freezing, hyper-dry atmospheric conditions. Far above this gruesome, terrifying spectacle, within the silent, highly pressurized safety of geostationary orbit, Supreme Commander Vax stared at the main tactical holographic screen in absolute, paralyzing disbelief. The expansive command bridge of the Dreadnought was terrifyingly quiet. Just a few moments ago, the deployed Vanguard represented the absolute, unstoppable fist of the vast empire. Now, the biometric telemetry feeds streaming continuously from the surface were a chaotic, blinking mess of red warning runes, Vital signs were plummeting drastically across the entire board. Internal core temperatures were dropping rapidly into fatal biological zones. Neural stress indicators were completely maxed out, signaling unimaginable levels of physical pain and psychological panic. Vax slammed his multi-jointed fists heavily against the reinforced glass of the command console, his secondary eyelids twitching uncontrollably in pure shock. The human race had completely deceived them all. Earth was not a defenseless, primitive sphere waiting quietly to be conquered. They knew we were coming. Vax roared loudly, his voice trembling with a potent mixture of unbridled rage and genuine, creeping fear. The primitive planetary scanners lied to us. This entire strategic plane is a highly sophisticated, completely subterranean biological acid trap zone. They intentionally lured our finest warriors into an area completely saturated with a localized, armor-dissolving chemical agent. What kind of monstrous, twisted species weaponizes the very ground they walk on? Down on the chemically poisoned runway. The dire situation had rapidly devolved from a catastrophic tactical disaster into a profoundly humiliating, desperate physical struggle for basic mobility. The shivering remnants of the alien squad frantically tried to flee the active chemical spray zone. They threw away their completely frozen, useless weapons and scrambled wildly toward the dark edges of the concrete. But the thick layer of propylene glycol had thoroughly mixed with the freezing snow, instantly transforming the rough asphalt into an impossibly slick, hyper-lubricated sheet of extremely sticky, neon green ice. The alien soldiers, shivering violently and screaming loudly in their shattered ultrasonic frequencies, could not find even a fraction of traction. They aggressively pushed off the ground with their heavy boots, only to have their legs violently and comically slip out from right under them. Heavy, agonizing thuds echoed rapidly through the roaring storm as elite, highly trained warriors repeatedly crashed face first into the freezing, viscous chemical slurry. When they desperately tried to push themselves up with their multi-jointed hands, the thick, syrupy consistency of the de-icing fluid caused their palms to slide rapidly outward, dropping them painfully back down onto the unyielding ice. They crawled. They thrashed wildly, and they clawed desperately at the flat ground, slipping and uncontrollably spinning in pathetic, disorganized circles. The sheer, sticky density of the neon green slime clung aggressively to their exposed limbs, rapidly pulling their vital body heat away at an incredibly accelerated rate. All semblance of strict military discipline, advanced tactical cohesion, and imperial dignity completely vanished into the winter night. The once terrifying vanguard of the almighty Xylaxian Empire had been completely and utterly neutralized, reduced to nothing more than a freezing, helpless mass of floundering bodies hopelessly trapped on a sticky, fluorescent runway, painfully waiting for the cold to finally claim them. The remaining Xylaxian forces were battered, violently freezing, and absolutely desperate. Their supreme stealth armor had melted into toxic green puddles. Their heavily touted plasma weaponry was nothing but frozen, useless metal blocks. Yet, the squad leader, a veteran of a dozen planetary conquests, refused to succumb to the frozen wasteland. He rallied his shivering troops, sending a frantic, localized biological pulse through their surviving neural links. They still possessed one final, devastating offensive capability, baked directly into their genetic code and heavily augmented by Imperial cybernetics. Every elite shock trooper carried a lethal, bioacoustic weapon nestled deep within their throats. The leader commanded them to initiate a synchronized resonant sonic strike. This was not a mere shout. It was a highly concentrated, directed weapon of mass destruction. By linking their cybernetic larynx modules together, the surviving aliens could generate an overlapping, catastrophic wave of infrasonic frequency. When pushed to maximum amplitude, this synchronized sonic beam possessed enough raw kinetic energy to effortlessly shatter heavily reinforced concrete bunkers and cause the soft, carbon-based brains of indigenous life forms, to violently explode within their own skulls. Despite the agonizing pain of the freezing temperatures and the chemical burns blistering their delicate skin, the remaining soldiers aligned themselves in a tight, shivering formation. They stood directly in the path of the approaching yellow halogen lights that pierced the swirling blizzard. They anchored their boots as best they could against the slippery, neon green ice. On the leader's silent command, they threw their heads back, their jaws unhinged, opening impossibly wide. Deep within their throats, the cybernetic implants began to furiously spool up. A dull, terrifying purple glow began to radiate from the back of their mouths. The very air around their faces began to visibly warp and violently ripple as they drew in a massive breath of the freezing atmosphere, preparing to unleash a frequency of pure, unadulterated acoustic annihilation. The sonic charge peaked, reaching the exact critical mass required to obliterate the massive mechanical beast lumbering toward them. Inside the heavily vibrating, diesel-smelling cabin of the 20-ton rotary snowplow, Enoch Bunn was entirely focused on a very specific, highly critical task. He was attempting to secure his stainless steel thermos back into the wildly rattling cup holder without taking his eyes off the dark, snow-swept runway. The massive machine hummed with immense mechanical power, completely isolated from the desperate alien struggle happening just a few hundred yards ahead. Suddenly, an enormous shape materialized directly out of the blinding white chaos. A massive snowy owl, boasting a wingspan of nearly 5 feet, swooped down from the violently swirling blizzard. Startled by the towering yellow halogen beams of the snowplow, the massive bird banked sharply, its heavy white wings violently slapping against the thick, reinforced glass of the windshield right in front of Enoch's face. The sudden, explosive thud against the glass triggered an immediate, deeply ingrained physiological response. Enoch jolted hard in his worn suspension seat. His left hand instinctively jerked the steering wheel a fraction of an inch, while his right hand completely missed the thermos holder, sending a large splash of lukewarm, bitter black coffee directly onto his worn denim jeans. "Son of a gun!" Enoch yelled out loudly in the empty cabin, driven purely by decades of deeply ingrained muscle memory and the absolute annoyance of a startled heavy machinery operator. Enoch did not reach for the air brakes. Instead, he reached straight upward. His calloused, grease-stained fingers tightly grabbed the thick metal chain hanging directly above his head. With a sharp, aggressive downward yank, he fully engaged the pneumatic valve of the primary roof-mounted air horn. The resulting sound was not a mere noise. It was a localized acoustic cataclysm. The massive, industrial-grade twin air horns, bolted to the roof of the 20-ton Leviathan, instantly unleashed a staggering, physical wall of sound, measuring exactly 150 decibels. It was a raw, unrefined, brutally loud blast of compressed air, designed specifically to be heard over miles of howling mountainous terrain and roaring diesel engines. The deafening and sustained blast tore violently through the freezing night air. It traveled at the speed of sound, carrying immense physical pressure, and slammed directly into the tight formation of Xylaxian shock troopers at the precise microsecond they prepared to unleash their own bioacoustic weapon. The timing was an astronomical improbability, resulting in absolute biological devastation. The aliens stood with their mouths agape, their cybernetic vocal cords fully exposed and primed to emit a highly structured, delicate, destructive frequency. Instead, they were violently struck by a chaotic, overwhelmingly powerful wall of crude mechanical noise. The extreme pressure differential created by the sudden collision of the two opposing sound waves was completely catastrophic for the aliens. The brutal, unrefined frequency of the trucker air horn aggressively overpowered the sophisticated alien resonance. The massive wall of sound forcibly pushed the dense, freezing air directly down their wide open throats. The delicate, highly engineered cybernetic larynx modules inside the aliens could not process the massive influx of physical acoustic pressure. The sudden backward force created a devastating rebound effect. Deep inside their necks, the implants violently overloaded and completely shattered. A horrific chorus of muffled, wet popping sounds echoed faintly beneath the roaring of the horn. The internal pressure ruptures instantly destroyed their vocal cords from the inside out. The elite soldiers immediately collapsed to their knees. They dropped their hands to their throats, grasping desperately at their completely ruined necks. Thick, glowing purple fluid erupted violently from their mouths and nostrils, spilling darkly onto the bright green, chemically soaked ice. Unable to breathe, unable to vocalize their immense pain, and entirely robbed of their final weapon, the last remnants of the mighty vanguard fell face forward onto the freezing asphalt, completely incapacitated by the sheer acoustic violence of a commercial vehicle warning system. Up in the warm, rumbling cab, the deafening blast of the air horn finally ceased as Enoch let go of the metal chain. The heavy, rhythmic thrumming of the twin turbo diesel engines took over the night once again. He grabbed a handful of rough paper towels from the dashboard and furiously began scrubbing at the dark coffee stain rapidly soaking into his jeans. "Stupid overgrown pigeon!" Enoch grumbled angrily, tossing the soiled paper towels onto the floorboard. "Nearly made me spill the whole damn cup. The things I put up with on this mountain." He glared out the windshield, watching the massive rotary blades easily chew through another thick snowdrift. He had absolutely no idea that his purely reflexive, highly irritated yank of the horn cord had just violently neutralized the absolute last line of defense of an invading extraterrestrial armada. He simply turned the dial on the radio, trying to find a station with less static, and continued his relentless, steady march down the runway, leaving the thoroughly defeated, purple-stained aliens far behind in his mechanical wake. Out in the unforgiving dark, far behind the roaring mechanical beast, exactly 8 Xylaxian shock troopers remained. They were no longer an elite vanguard. They were a shattered, freezing, and hopelessly traumatized collection of broken extraterrestrials. Their impenetrable biological armor was completely gone, replaced by a thin layer of freezing green sludge. Their advanced vocal modules were violently ruptured, leaving them completely mute. They dragged their battered, rapidly stiffening bodies across the mercilessly cold concrete, driven purely by the absolute most primal instinct to simply survive the night. Through the relentless, howling curtain of the blizzard, a beacon of hope suddenly appeared. At the far edge of the vast concrete plain stood a wide, low-slung structure composed largely of thick glass and steel. A warm, inviting yellow light bled through the frosted panes, casting a soft glow against the raging storm. To the desperate alien minds, this structure was clearly a heavily fortified human command bunker, a vital strategic strongpoint emitting significant thermal energy. The 8 shivering survivors limped heavily toward the sanctuary. They did not attempt any sophisticated tactical breaching maneuvers, driven entirely by freezing panic. The lead trooper simply threw his heavy, chemically soaked shoulder directly against the thick glass of the automatic sliding doors. The glass shattered violently under the impact, raining down in thousands of sharp pieces as the aliens spilled blindly into the brightly lit interior. They immediately scrambled for cover, fully expecting to face a barrage of advanced kinetic projectiles or localized energy beams. They pressed their shivering blue bodies against the nearest walls, their large black eyes darting wildly around the supposed military installation. However, the command bunker was entirely devoid of any visible defensive countermeasures. There were no armed guards, no automated turrets, and no tactical holographic maps. There were only long rows of cheap, black, synthetic leather waiting chairs, bolted securely to a gray carpet, bathed in the sickly, buzzing light of several flickering fluorescent tubes. Suddenly, a low, Rhythmic whirring sound echoed from the far end of the terminal concourse. The aliens instantly froze in sheer terror. Approaching them slowly was a human. It was not a towering, heavily armored super soldier. It was Gary. Gary was a 70-year-old night shift janitor who was profoundly hard of hearing. He was wearing a faded blue jumpsuit and a massive pair of heavy-duty, industrial noise-canceling headphones firmly clamped over his ears. He was casually steering a large, motorized floor-scrubbing machine, humming completely off-key to a classic rock song only he could hear. The Xylaxian troopers watched in absolute, paralyzed dread as Gary calmly guided his machine in wide, deliberate circles over the dirty linoleum. They completely misinterpreted the mundane cleaning equipment. To their traumatized minds, the humming floor scrubber was obviously a mobile, close-quarters microwave emitter, creating an invisible, deadly protective wave that sanitized the surrounding area of any biological threats. They flattened themselves desperately against the cold walls, sliding silently in the opposite direction, utterly terrified of drawing the attention of the oblivious old man and his terrible humming device. As they crept frantically away from Gary, their frantic eyes locked onto another imposing structure standing silently against the far wall. It was a tall, rectangular monolith, brightly illuminated from within. Behind a thick pane of reinforced glass sat neat, orderly coils holding hundreds of brightly colored, perfectly sealed packages. To the starving, freezing invaders, these were clearly highly concentrated organic energy capsules, emergency rations stored securely for the human commanders. One of the troopers, his pale blue skin practically translucent from the severe cold and chemical exposure, staggered desperately toward the machine. He ignored all remaining military discipline. He needed the thermal energy contained within those bright little bags of potato chips and chocolate bars. He raised a long, multi-jointed limb, fully intending to violently shatter the glass and claim the precious resources. He brought his bare, chemically drenched hand heavily against the side of the machine. The metal casing of the snack dispenser, positioned directly next to the newly shattered entrance doors, had completely absorbed the ambient, negative 30-degree temperature of the blizzard outside. The moment the alien's incredibly damp, freezing flesh made contact with the supercooled metal surface, basic thermodynamics took over. The heavy moisture on his hand froze instantaneously. His palm was perfectly and absolutely welded to the side of the vending machine. The trooper yanked his arm back violently, but the ice bond was entirely unbreakable. He was completely stuck, pinned securely to the side of the snack dispenser like a grotesque, freezing decoration. He thrashed his body wildly, pulling with all of his remaining extraterrestrial strength. But the thick, icy seal refused to yield a single inch. His silent screams of panic went completely unheard as his limbs flailed uselessly against the humming metal box. The remaining 7 troopers watched this horrific display unfold and completely snapped. Their brilliant, galaxy-conquering minds completely shattered under the absolute absurdity of the situation. They had just witnessed one of their finest warriors get effortlessly consumed and permanently immobilized by a glowing metal box that did not even utilize kinetic energy or a localized plasma field to neutralize its prey. The machine had simply grabbed him and refused to let go. All remaining traces of sanity and imperial military resolve instantly evaporated. The 7 aliens broke into a clumsy, pathetic run, fleeing as far away from the demonic energy capsule dispenser as the empty terminal would allow. They scrambled aggressively into a dark corner of the waiting area, desperately piling their shivering bodies on top of one another to share whatever meager body heat they had left. Above their trembling, defeated pile hung a large, brightly lit travel billboard depicting a sun-drenched tropical beach in the Bahamas, aggressively mocking their absolute ruin. They huddled securely together under the picture of paradise, utterly broken by a hard-of-hearing janitor and a hostile vending machine, helplessly waiting for the end. High above the spiraling winter storm, within the dead silence of geostationary orbit, Supreme Commander Vax stared at the glowing holographic data streams with wide, completely unblinking secondary eyelids. The tactical readouts from the surface were an absolute, terrifying impossibility. In less than one standard hour, the most elite vanguard of the Xylaxian Empire had been utterly eradicated. Vax frantically analyzed the final combat telemetry. He watched in profound horror as their supreme bioacoustic strike was violently overwhelmed by a crude, astronomically powerful kinetic sound wave. He saw the environmental sensors register the neon green acid traps that effortlessly dissolved their impenetrable armor. And finally, he watched the horrific live feed of his last surviving soldiers being silently captured and permanently immobilized by stationary, glowing metallic sentinels inside a perfectly sterile, brightly lit holding pen. Vax stepped back from the console, his brilliant, galaxy-conquering mind desperately trying to rationalize the overwhelming defeat. He reached the only logical, terrifying conclusion. The human race was not a primitive civilization of soft, carbon-based bipeds. They were a monstrous species of apex acoustic predators. They deliberately lubricated their vast, flat hunting grounds with highly toxic chemical solvents. Even worse, they had successfully domesticated colossal, mechanical demons, riding inside the bellies of these roaring beasts to violently chew up and spit out their enemies. At that exact moment, down on the surface of the violently frozen planet, Enoch Bunn was making his final pass past the brightly lit windows of the airport terminal. He steered the massive rotary snowplow along the edge of the concrete, pushing the engine to clear the last heavy drift. The massive steel impeller wheel caught a towering, tightly compacted bank of snow and violently launched it upward. Thousands of pounds of heavy, wet ice and pulverized snow shot through the air in a massive, blinding white arc. The frozen payload slammed heavily against the thick glass of the terminal building, completely burying the entire eastern flank of the structure under a solid, impenetrable wall of ice. Inside the terminal, the massive thud of the snowbank hitting the glass violently shook the walls, instantly crushing the delicate emergency transponder the huddled aliens were desperately trying to activate. Up on the command bridge of the Dreadnought, the final flickering biometric signal from the surface abruptly vanished into pure static, accompanied by the terrifying visual of a massive white avalanche swallowing the camera feed. Vax screamed in absolute, unfiltered terror. He brought his heavy fists down, completely shattering the glass of the main tactical display. "Abort the invasion!" Vax roared, his voice cracking with panic as he turned to his terrified flight crew. "Engage the emergency dimensional drive immediately. Delete this cursed planet from every Imperial star map. Erase the coordinates. We are leaving the solar system right now, before those acoustic monsters realize we are up here." In the blink of an eye, the massive Xylaxian dreadnought violently warped space, vanishing from orbit in a silent, massive burst of displaced tachyonic energy. Down on Earth, the immense electromagnetic ripple from the emergency dimensional jump caused a brief power surge across the airport grid. Inside the empty terminal concourse, the small television mounted above the waiting chairs violently fizzed out into a loud, gray static. Gary, the janitor, paused his floor scrubbing machine. He calmly walked over to the television, heavily smacked the side of the plastic casing twice with the palm of his hand, and nodded in satisfaction as the late-night infomercial popped back onto the screen. He adjusted his heavy noise, canceling headphones, and went right back to mopping the floor. Out on the tarmac, Enoch Bunn let out a long, heavy sigh of relief. Through the cleared windshield, the black asphalt of runway number 4 gleamed beautifully under the yellow runway lights. He reached out and firmly pulled the heavy transmission lever into park, He ignored the coffee stain on his jeans, reached into his lunch cooler, and pulled out his secondary thermos. He unscrewed the cap and took a slow, deep sip of warm, heavily salted canned chicken soup. The rich broth chased away the deep chill of the cabin. Enoch smiled a genuine, satisfied smile, leaning back into his worn suspension seat. It had been a long, cold shift, but the runway was totally clear, and he was absolutely thrilled that he was going to collect 4 hours of premium overtime pay without running into any major trouble. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to our story today. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you enjoyed this cosmic winter tale, please consider supporting our channel with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the donate QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the donation link provided in the description and the pinned comment. Your generous support allows us to pay our incredibly hard-working team, helping them feed their families and ensuring we can keep writing, creating, and bringing you even more fantastic adventures in the future. Thank you again, and stay safe out there.